the way a chimpanzee would walk bipedally is the way, opposed to the way Lucy would have walked bipedally based on the morphology of the hips and legs, and then compared to a human. So you can see that she's much more like a human in the bipedal locomotion than with an ape, like a chimpanzee. However, we do see that, again, we get this picture of a patchwork or mosaic evolution, even from Lucy, or Australopithecus Afarensis, for which we do have quite a few fossils. There's significant sexual dimorphism, so significant size and shape differences between the males and females of about 55%. So modern gorillas, males are about twice as big as females, so it's like 100% dimorphism. Modern humans, we have about 10% sexual dimorphism on average. Chimpanzees today, about 15% sexual dimorphism. So sexual dimorphism, about 55%, is pretty significant level of dimorphism, even greater than what we see in modern chimpanzees and bonobos today. So we have a male on the left and a female on the right. The males are also going to have larger brow ridges, larger nuchal cresting, thing of that nature. And much larger, more robust mandibles. That's sort of an ape-like characteristic. When we look at the shoulder, particularly the scapula of Afarensis, using Lucy as an example, as we often do because of how complete the skeleton was, we see that the glenoid fossa, or the area where the head of the humerus articulates with the scapula to make the shoulder joint, here on Lucy, right? Notice that it's angled pretty laterally, but it also is kind of up, compared to a human where that glenoid fossa is totally lateral in orientation and our arms hang to the side. Apes, like chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, have a much more cranial angle to that glenoid fossa because they're adapted to suspensory behavior. So more time with the arms spent over the head. Right? Whereas we, although we can engage in suspensory behavior, it becomes tiring after a period of time, right? Because our arms, although they can engage in that behavioral pattern, are not truly adapted for it. So Lucy has a more cranially or superiorly oriented glenoid fossa, which suggests arboreal behavior in Lucy. This is further supported by the presence of long arms. And when we look at the finger bones, we see that here's a gorilla. And even though gorillas don't spend that much time engaged in suspensory behavior, particularly adults, because of their size, they can. They are adapted to suspensory behavior. We see curved finger bones or phalanges. Here on Afarensis, we have slight curvature, not as much as you see in the gorilla, and then you compare it to the very straight phalanges that you see in the human hand. You can see that, again, Afarensis is sort of falling in between the ape-like state and a more modern human state. Now, I mentioned that with Lucy, we didn't have any real foot bones, so it wasn't entirely clear what the foot of Australopithecus Afarensis was like until the discovery of some footprints at the site of Laetoli in Tanzania. So Laetoli is a site that was worked by the Leakeys and Lewis and Mary Leakey. This was a find that was overseen primarily by Mary Leakey. There are students out working in this area, and you can see that you can see that here is ground surface, right, around here. And then underneath that, there's a layer here. This area that's been exposed here, that is volcanic tuff that has been, they've stripped off the overlaying sediment and come down right on this volcanic tuff layer. It was where volcanic ash had fallen and settled. And initially, it was very wet, kind of like mud. And all sorts of creatures walked across this wet, ashy area, including at least 3 hominins. And this would have been Australopithecus Afarensis, because we have Australopithecus Afarensis fossils from this site, nearby sites from the same time period. So you have human footprints, or these, not human, Australopithecus Afarensis footprints here, and there are lots of other animals that were also traversing this area, right? So these are footprints of individuals, 3 individuals who walked across this landscape 3.6 million years ago. These footprints can be directly dated because they are in the volcanic ash. They were placed there when the ash was fresh and soft and could take the impression of the footprint and the weight bearing down. 3.6 million years ago. And when we look at these footprints up close, not only are they amazing to see, sort of from a macro perspective, but looking at them closely, we can see that these footprints, here it is from Laetoli, looking at these footprints have a heel strike, right? A longitudinal arch, and a big toe that is mostly in line with the rest of the toes. So more of a platform with that longitudinal arch for drawing a blank, for shock absorption, right? So we've got that here. This is the footprint of Australopithecus Afarensis. Here is a footprint made in similar material of someone like you or I, walking with a non-divergent big toe and the longitudinal arch. Heel strike, longitudinal arch, toe in line with all the other toes, big toe in line with all the other toes. So it has been suggested that despite the fact that Lucy has a hip similar to ours, not identical, femora similar to ours but not identical, then maybe they walked with more of a bent hip, they kind of leaned over. Always that sort of primitive idea. So bent knee, bent hip is the BKBH, and this is the type of footprint that leaves behind, that type of walking. And as you can see, that is not consistent with what we see in anatomically modern humans or in Lucy. The footprint pattern that Australopithecus Afarensis creates is much more similar to what we have in modern humans than in something walking with a bent hip, bent knee, but in a bipedal locomotor pattern. So this suggests that Lucy's form of bipedal locomotion was much more similar to ours than like a chimpanzee or a bonobo would walk as a biped today. Now these footprints, here's a close-up. Like I said, there are 3 individuals who walked across the landscape or across this volcanic ash. There was a larger individual, a smaller individual that walked off to the side, and then there was a 3rd individual who came along after, at least after the first large individual, and put their feet inside the footprints of the large individual. put their foot inside, they purposely put their feet inside those footprints, almost as if they didn't really want to get that ashy, sticky stuff on their feet. It sounds like a very human thing to do, right? This is a reconstruction by an artist, obviously, of what this scene may have looked like, with various different types of animals also traversing this area covered in ash. And obviously the larger footprints are often depicted as being male, the smaller from a female. And as we know, the high degree of sexual dimorphism that's possible could also have been an adult and a younger individual as well. At least we don't get the versions of the reconstruction where the male has his arm around the female as he's shepherding her through this dangerous lava field or whatever. That was the old way of depicting this. So there are those footprints. So with Australopithecus afarensis, we have foramen magnum underneath the cranium, smaller canine, no CP3 honing complex, a bowl-shaped pelvis, valgus angle at the knee, non-divergent first toe, longitudinal arch of the foot. Taken together, what does that tell us about Australopithecus afarensis? Yes, bipedalism, right? Obligate bipeds by 3.6 million years ago. And those Itelli footprints are really critical because we can directly date those footprints to 3.6 million years ago. Now, you also have another series of traits, a small cranial capacity. On average, in all the Australopithecus afarensis specimens, we're looking at 438 cubic centimeters. Compare that to the modern human average of about 1325 cubic centimeters. You can tell this is a pretty small cranial capacity in the ape range. Prognathic face, narrow palate, relatively long arms, cranially oriented shoulder, curved fingers, and relatively small body size and significant sexual dimorphism. What do you think that pattern together tells us about Australopithecus afarensis? Are they just like you and I, but just sort of shrunk down little? No. They have a lot of ape-like characteristics still being retained. A lot of ape-like characteristics, and chances are that utilizing trees quite a bit. So we have a wooded setting with obligatory bipedalism or habitual bipedalism, but they're also accessing arboreal resources, foods, and using the trees for safety, things of that nature. So it was probably very beneficial to be able to both locomote bipedally, which is more energetically efficient on the ground, but also be able to fairly easily climb trees to access arboreal resources. Okay? And we will, next class period, talk about Australopithecus africanus, other Australopithecines, and early Homo. Get into